my hair look weird. Holy shit. I imagine there'll be some copyright-free music I'm going to throw in here. So, we're going to be discussing a question as old as British politics itself. Not really. Not at all. Actually, I don't know why I said that. We're just discussing a definitely a controversial question which has been delved into by many people who are much smarter than me. Many people a lot more in depth than me. However, I still feel like I can add something to the conversation, I hope. So I'm adapting this video off of an essay that I completed a few weeks ago. That is just being graded. End of module essay for I'm in university studying politics, and I received a first for this essay. I'm not saying this to brag, maybe a little bit. I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this just to illustrate that I do talk out my arse a lot, but in this particular case, I don't think I am. You know, either I've said something which is worth listening to, or I don't know, articulated my point very well, enough to get a good grade. Regardless, the question in question is, to what extent can Thatcherism be defined as a success? So, Thatcher remains the most controversial post-war Prime Minister, I think, to date. I don't think that's really disputable. Maybe Boris Johnson would come close. Maybe Tony Blair, maybe because of the Iraq War. But I think Margaret Thatcher stands above both of those in the incredibly divisive. You know, figures like Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, even Boris Johnson nowadays, they are less talked about because they're so unequivocally shit, right? I didn't write that, obviously, in the essay, but you know, people like Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, for the most part now, there's not much to discuss about them because it's almost unanimously agreed they were terrible prime ministers, especially with Liz Truss. There's a fly in my room. Okay, so, you know, her eponymous ideology, Thatcherism, it ushered in a new age for the UK, which is probably the most influential prime minister post-war. You know, drastically transformed the country's economy, society, global standing, all this stuff. And I'm going to be splitting this question. So the question is, to what extent can Thatcherism be defined as a success? I split it into two ways of viewing it, two lenses: politically and societally. So politically, a success or not, I'm talking about to what extent was Thatcherism a success in achieving its aims. And the impact that it had. And then societally, or on the UK as a whole, that'll be looking at the more concrete and actual realised impacts of Thatcherism and whether or not it can be considered a success for the UK or not. So there's two different things. So, it can almost unequivocally be called a political success. It definitely can. You know, Thatcher and Major, you know, I'm going to be talking about Thatcher and John Major here, because they both fall into the same category of Thatcherism, in my opinion. Though there's slight differences, particularly with, you know, things like foreign policy and Europe, but I kind of put them into one thing. Just to summarise my arguments. So, Thatcherism was almost unequivocally a success politically. Thatcher and Major won 4 consecutive general elections. 4. It's insane. They had an 18-year tenure, right? You know, they won these 4 general elections. They had so much time to entrench their neoliberal, their monetarist views. It can still really be felt today. And their 18-year tenure sounded a death knell for socialism in the UK. However, to argue against the fact that it was a success politically, this period of Thatcherism stoked discord within the Conservative Party on issues such as Europe. So it was the kind of brazen and controversial nature of Thatcherism, and the kind of what would be the word for it? It was very inconsistent, Thatcherism. It was circumstantial. It kind of changed based on whatever Thatcher was feeling at the time. It was very inconsistent, which meant that when she was gone from the party, the Conservative Party kind of didn't know where to go on a lot of issues. It self-imploded, right, in the mid-90s, early mid-90s. And that led to the massive New Labour period. So, you can say on one hand, it was a success politically, Thatcherism, because of its impact on socialism and the way it impacted the Labour Party even, and just how entrenched their views have become in British society. However, you could also say it kind of led to the downfall of the Conservative Party for quite a period. And it required, I'm not going to elaborate more on that, I'll go into that when I actually discuss it. And then the other way that we can look at it is through a economic and social success side on the UK as a whole. That question is a lot more challenging to answer. Some would argue that Thatcher's extreme reforms were harsh but necessary to drag the UK into the modern world, revitalise the economy, bring needed centralised control to Downing Street. But critics would point to her dogmatic monetarism, that is a quote from Elliott in 2013, or economic shock therapy, as Whistler put it. It caused extreme inequality. It helped sow the seeds for many of the issues which the UK faces today, such as the NHS crisis, the North-South divides, the cost of living crisis, even Brexit. You can tie all of these back to Thatcher in many ways, Thatcherism. So the essay will weigh these perspectives to take a view on the extent to which the ideology could be considered politically, economically, and socially a success. So, first we'll go on to the politics. Thatcherism has basically been the major defining ideology of the political landscape in the UK since it came to power in 1979. It was immensely successful from a political perspective, not only in the short term during Thatcher's tenure, but also has since been massively influential. So, if we want to look at actually her tenure and whether that was politically successful, we can tell that it was, because she was very successful in enacting her policy objectives, particularly as her tenure progressed. So as things got on, she got a lot more confident with how to pursue her policies. So she successfully curbed the influence of unions, for example, with the membership very steeply declining in the 80s and 90s. So we can see throughout the 80s and 90s, there was a progression from very reasonable kind of union regulation in her early tenure to the complete disarming of striking as an effective protest that was seen later on. That helps to illustrate the success with which Thatcherism progressed. The Conservatives grew emboldened, right, to mercilessly pursue their policy agenda in their later years. So to illustrate this with the trade unions, I'll give some examples. It began 1980, the Employment Act, which is a union regulation, which is quite tame, really, in terms of anti-union acts go. It basically required unions to use postal voting in elections, so it made running a ballot slightly more convoluted, slightly more expensive. But the pace of anti-union action really picked up, especially during Major's era. So 1992 Act stated that a union must be recognised by an employer before a legal industrial action can happen, which kind of defeats the point of a union. If the employer can just go, no, we don't recognise you, therefore you're not allowed to strike, it's like, what? And then in 1993 Act stating that a minimum of 7 days notice before a strike action was required, which again completely disarms unions. So you can see in the early tenure, it seems like they're being cautious, they're a bit gingerly with how they want to be anti-union, but then you can see much later on, oh wow, these people have a massive majority now, quite a secure party, they're going to go crazy on unions. And they did, which kind of illustrates it was a success politically. They were able to successfully pursue their political agenda very well. So, 1983 election saw her majority increase by 100 seats. That is basically the height of Thatcherism. That's when she had a massive majority, and you can see then that's when the anti-union stuff started to pick up. She grew confident, and she also eased out wets from the cabinet. She called them wets. That was dissenters. That was people who weren't Thatcherites. Got them out of the cabinet. So simply put, there was a transformation from consensus to conviction in numerous aspects of Thatcher's tenure, and this definitely lends weight to the interpretation that Thatcherism was an unparalleled political success during the 80s and the early 90s. Okay, so as impressive, maybe even more impressive, as the contemporary political success of Thatcherism, during its implementation, was the long-term impact of Thatcherism. That's possibly, in my opinion, even more politically impressive. So, just to basically sum up the entire point here that I'm going to make, I can do it quite simply. In 2002, at a dinner party, one of those rich conservative dinner parties that all these people have together, Thatcher was asked what her greatest achievement was. 2002, so she's been gone for quite a while now. Keep in mind, 2002, Tony Blair's been in power for 5 years. 2002, she's asked, what's your greatest achievement, Thatcher? She says, my greatest achievement is Tony Blair and New Labour. We forced our opponents to change their minds. So without Thatcherism, we would not have witnessed the complete metamorphosis of the Labour Party in the 1990s. Neoliberalism had thoroughly permeated civil society and public policy. It essentially killed off socialism as an electorally viable option in the UK. Right? Because obviously, if you don't know much about the New Labour, the way they were, it was a massive divide between New Labour and Old Labour. New Labour emerged victorious, a far cry from Old Labour. They removed Clause 4 from their Labour constitution, which was their support of public ownership, I think, or cooperation, or something like that. Anyway, they became essentially a centrist party, with some leaning to the left, like Gordon Brown, still some Old Labour people, obviously, in the party. Then, characters like Alistair Campbell, who would be responsible for the later Iraq War. So, definitely a lot of neoconservative ideas coming from the party. So, the reason that happened is because socialism was no longer a viable option electorally. You could not win an election as a socialist party anymore at that point. Or at least that's what they believed. Whether that's true or not is a whole other issue. You can look at Jeremy Corbyn and how close he got, and if the stars are like if we had a socialist party and the Labour Party right now, at the time of me recording this is Rishi Sunak in power, it's just before a general election. If we had a socialist Labour Party now, they would definitely still win. So the idea that socialism is electorally unviable, I don't think I buy. But its viability was definitely hindered by Thatcherism to a massive extent, and it forced the Labour Party to completely shift to no longer being, ironically, a party centred on Labour. Centred around business more, to be completely honest. So, this was achieved by Thatcher through various means. Firstly, there was the managed decline of trade unions. That meant decreased funding for any socialist party. The Labour Party was basically the political arm of the unions. So, this meant a decline in socialist voters as well, because trade unions were hubs, that fostered left-wing ideas. And then secondly, mass privatisation. That meant a collapse in employment as labour was exported, right, from many regions, such as, old mining communities no longer had jobs. And what happened was that there was a shift to the growth of the financial sector rather than industry. So as industry declined, there weren't as many working class industry workers, and therefore the voting bloc of socialism decreased. You can also look at the selling of council homes. These completely altered the fabric of British society, and these factors culminated in the decline of industry in the UK and a dramatic growth in the middle class. It neutered the residual socialist movement that saw its voting bloc diminished and in decline. This is confirmed by statistics compiled in 2001 by Heath et al. It shows a massive drop in the percentage of the labour force who were working class. So, in 1979, the year that Thatcher comes to power, 49% of the labour force were working class. So that's obviously going to be overwhelmingly Labour voters. And in 1997, by the time Tony Blair's in charge, 18 years later, it's dropped to 34%, 49 to 34. That might not sound like a crazy drop, 49 to 34. Like, okay, think about it electorally. With a 49% majority, obviously this is not exactly how the statistics work. I'm just trying to illustrate how much in politics 49 is compared to 34. A party with 34% maybe could get elected into governments. A party with 49% of the vote, I don't think it's ever been done. I don't think anyone's got that high of a percentage of vote. I could be wrong. Definitely not post-war. absurdly high. So it falling like that will have major electoral repercussions, and it did. So Thatcherism made socialism a politically unpalatable idea in the UK, as illustrated through, you could say, the failure of Jeremy Corbyn and the fact that the country has had no staunchly left-wing government since 1979. How far ago is that? 21 plus 24? That's 45 years ago, and it doesn't look like we're going to get one anytime soon. It could be a century before we get another left-wing government. It essentially killed off socialism. It's absurd. I can't overstate the impact that Thatcherism had. So this consolidates the view that Thatcherism was a huge success politically. To challenge this view, however, if you want to look at why maybe you shouldn't consider it to be politically successful, sorry, I'm fucking around with my headphones here. To challenge this view, however, you could look at the declined and fractured state of the Conservative Party after Thatcher's downfall, particularly preceding the 1992 general election, the one where the Conservatives just basically scraped a government together. So if Thatcherism was such a successful ideology politically, why did it directly lead to the complete electoral collapse of the Conservatives for over a decade? The bitter infighting, this is from McAnulla, 2010. I'll leave in the description a list of references. The bitter infighting that arose over debates concerning how far Thatcherite heritage should be embraced or dropped. Right, so there was a lot of disputing among the Conservatives when she left. One particularly malignant rift that kept the Conservatives pinned to the opposition benches during this period was over Europe. So this divide can be traced back to Thatcher's tenure. There were disagreements over the European, the ERM, the Euro, the what is it? The Euro, ERM. I've forgotten exactly what. Hold on. European rate mechanism. European ERM. No. Yes, European exchange rate mechanism. Of course, it's bad that I didn't know off the top of my head. The exchange rate mechanism. So there's lots of disagreements over the exchange rate mechanism. Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor, I believe at the time, was very much in favour. Thatcher was staunchly against. There was a squabble that culminated in his resignation in 1989, Lawson's. So the issue of European solidarity or isolation, it gathered strength throughout the 90s within the Conservatives, until it had taken the form of a fearful and frenzied question which clamoured insistently for an answer, as it still does. It was the seemingly all-consuming issue among the Conservatives that led to the election of William Hague as party leader. Not Prime Minister, because it was Tony Blair in power at this point, party leader. He meant to be a compromise candidate between the pro and the anti-European sections of the party, ultimately pleasing neither. So, as put by, this is a really good way of putting it. So, this was Tim Bale in 2016. He said there was no internal post-mortem which sought to analyse why the party had been so roundly defeated in 1997, but rather the entire leadership election turned to Europe and turned to the single currency, and the squabbling and the infighting meant that the Conservatives couldn't recover. Thatcherism additionally left further rifts into the Conservatives over immigration, social justice, taxation. The party was a mess, basically, once she's left. It led to a complete gridlock, which caused the party's ideological stagnation. It wasn't going anywhere. It was stuck in the past, while New Labour seemed to have all the answers. It wasn't until Cameron emerged, David Cameron, he emerged basically with a rhetoric mimicking New Labour's third way, mimicking their pitch for the political centre, mimicking Tony Blair. It wasn't until then that the Conservatives eventually succeeded. So this lends to the view that, you can say Thatcherism was a political success in the short term, but its long-term impact on the Conservatives and their unity was nothing short of disastrous. It took the partial endorsement of New Labour's social democracy for the Conservatives to thrive again. So a very far cry from Thatcherism. done with the political section. Now we're on to the juicy bit. So that part is all kind of boring politics stuff if you're into politics. This section is the stuff which people have debated and argued over far more when it comes to this. So now we're discussing the impact of Thatcherism on the UK as a whole. This coffee is so strong. Oh man, I have it black. Shoot me. So the more discussed and contentious lens with which to view the question of Thatcherism's success is whether it was successful for the UK and whether it was successful for its citizens. You know, we were discussing all the politics shit earlier, now we're into the actual country. So Thatcher and her supporters would argue that her ideology was successful throughout her tenure. You know, it fixed the problems that were inherited from an incompetent Labour government and decades of Keynesian consensus. So, when finally achieving an electoral mandate and getting elected in 1979, Thatcher owed her success largely due to the failure of previous Labour cabinets. So we'll go into a bit of background here, we'll go into a bit of history. So, primarily, it was the Callaghan government. So, just before Thatcher was elected, James Callaghan was in power for Labour. Labour's handling of union and strike action was perceived as weak. I'm saying perceived as weak because, you know, you've got to be objective in these essays, but make no mistakes, their handling of strike action was abysmal. They could not do it. Labour was out, not Labour, when I say Labour I mean like workers. Labour was out of control. Which I'm a socialist, isn't a very socialist thing to say, but they were not handling strikes and unions properly at all. The country was in disarray. So Thatcher's first victory can be largely be seen as an indictment of the winter of discontent, right? Which was the winter from, you know, end of 1978 to the start of 1979, so just a few months before she got elected. That was still fresh in the minds of the British public. That's partly the reason she got elected, because throughout the entire this winter of discontent, there was so much strike action. You know, it was winter, it was cold. People didn't have their heating. People didn't have their electricity because of all these strikes. So everyone wanted the Callaghan government out. So, you know, in contrast to the Callaghan government, Thatcher was extremely combative against unions, vocally against them. You know, and during the 80s and 90s, it was a priority of the government to extinguish disruptive industrial action. And they were successful. So the number of strikes in the UK dramatically dropped from 2,310 from 1975 to 1979, so that was end of the Callaghan government, end of the Labour government. So 2,310 to 838 by the end of Thatcher's reign, 1985. Sorry, the end of John Major's reign, 1985 to 1990. So that is just over a third of what it was at the start. So throughout the 18 years of Conservative government, they massively reduced strike action. So she was clearly successful in her ambition to quash industrial action. However, you know, while the supporters will be like, yeah, this is evidence that she was a success. Look at, you know, she dealt with the issues of the Labour government. However, the dismantling of union power caused untold damage in both the short and the long term, particularly for wealth inequality. So the destruction of union power helped silence dissenting voices and enabled a period of increasing unemployment and poverty in the north, as workers were incapable of combating mass layoffs and incapable of combating privatisation. Unemployment rose from 5.4% to 11.9% from 1979 to 1984. First 5 years she's in power, unemployment more than doubles. Oh, it's insane. These aren't, you know, untold consequences. Oh, who could have seen this coming? This was her view. This was the Conservative Party's view. We don't give a shit. We will prioritise low inflation. And it was definitely someone on the Thatcher cabinet said something like in an interview, or maybe it was in private, because this is so dastardly. It must have been in private. We are making a trade for low London inflation in exchange for high northern unemployment. So they're basically saying we're prioritising low London inflation, you know, and the payoff for that is high unemployment in the north, but who gives a shit? You know, they can deal with it. So that's kind of the monetarist view. It's dealing with inflation rather than employment, and it leads to this. And she knew that. Unions are essential, basically, for a society. Unless unions are essential in a country like the UK. So, for example, people point to Norway and Scandinavia, and they say, yeah, they there's not a lot of wealth inequality in Scandinavia, as people know. It's kind of viewed by a lot of left wing people as being, their ideal society, the closest they can get to an ideal society that currently exists, right? And yet their union membership is basically nothing. Very few unions in Scandinavia. So you'd think, well, how does that make any sense? How is it so equal but there's no unions? It's because they don't need unions. Because there's so much regulation, but on a government level, that there's no need for unions to emerge and fight back against their employees because it's already fine. You know what I mean? There's already strict and effective regulation. The UK does not have that. Unions are necessary in the absence of very tight government regulation. There is neither tight government regulation on employers, nor was there unions, and that is a dangerous pair that leads to massive inequality, as clearly seen. It's observable. These are just facts. Whether it's about what you prioritize, really. It's about whether or not you give a shit about mass unemployment in the north, and these guys didn't. So, yeah, and here you go. Furthermore, the decline of worker powers. This is just to illustrate how detrimental this was to the UK economy. The decline of worker power over the past 40 years was likely to be holding wages down by £100 a week in 2022. So that's the height of the cost of living crisis. You can trace these issues that we're currently having back to the Thatcherite policy and what has continued on with New Labour, who've basically adopted the Thatcherite position on unions. Dismantling of worker power, it has led to an exacerbation of the cost of living crisis as we currently see it. So to summarise, while neoliberals would credit Thatcherism with dismantling worker power and they'd consider this a success, the impact of this managed decline has been a huge failure for the UK's prosperity and income equality in the short term, and in the long term, as seen by the stats during the cost of living crisis. So another impact of Thatcherism, which is hailed by its supporters, is that it helped to properly establish the City of London as the world's biggest financial centre, with a huge influx of foreign capital. It's from Minford. So, for those who don't know, the City of London is, bar Wall Street, basically the biggest financial centre on the planet. And it was not like that. Thatcher helped grow that. So the growth of the city is, it is very important to the UK economy. The entire rest of the UK economy is essentially subsidised by the City of London. Scotland, the north, fucking Somerset, the south, anywhere that is outside of the city, the rest of London, it is all subsidised by the City of London. It makes so much money, it's absurd, from financial services. So the growth of the city has aided the UK economy in a myriad of ways. Here we go. It accounts for 20% of financial jobs in Great Britain, and it generates almost £1 billion in economic input annually. But the Thatcherite shift towards limited government intervention, low inflation, and the expansion of the financial sector, it came at the cost of economic impoverishment outside of London, and it additionally helped to exacerbate many of the impacts that the mortgage crisis had on the UK years later. So these neoliberal deregulations, which I think can most clearly be seen by Thatcher with the Big Bang reforms, which massively deregulated the UK economy and financial sector. This it potentially fostered innovation, efficiency. However, it also opened the door to very excessive risk taking and speculative behaviour. It was following the footsteps of America. This is a period, this brought in a period in which, this is a quote from Stewart and Goodley, 2011, the Americans arrived to snap up ancient city institutions for huge premiums. The UK became so connected with Wall Street, and all of the problems with Wall Street came along too. So Thatcherism cannot be blamed for the 2008 crisis. Obviously, that was subprime mortgage loans done by fucking stupid companies in America. It was down to a lack of regulation in America. However, it undoubtedly played the decisive role in the UK's impetuous integration into the financial sector via the Big Bang. It intensified the impacts of the financial crash on the UK economy in 2008. If it wasn't for the Big Bang reforms, you could say that the financial crash wouldn't have massively impacted us as a country, but it did. Speak to your parents if you're in the UK. This is a financial crash that happened in America because American bankers were being stupid with mortgage loans, handing them out to people who couldn't pay them. And this bubble just burst, basically. You should watch The Big Short. It's a good movie on it. it shouldn't impact the UK, but it did. It massively. Ask your parents if you're living in the UK. Go, do you remember the financial crash, 2008? And you go, yeah, it was a tough period. Obviously, I didn't live through it. I would have been like 4 or whatever, sitting around like eating shit or whatever I did when I was 4 years old, like smearing poo on. I don't know, whatever I was doing when I was 4, watching Shrek. I wasn't acutely aware of the financial struggle which my parents were in, but I can guarantee you they were struggling. 2008 affected the British economy massively. So not only did the not only did the prioritization of the city, that's what they call the city of London, via dogmatic monetarism, it came at the cost of peripheral prosperity, right? So this focus on London, it was this idea of a shift away from industry and a shift to finance, and that's fine in theory, whatever, give people financial jobs, okay. Issue is with that, the UK's industry had employment spread across the entire country. You'd have miners in Durham, and you'd have whatever miners in fucking Somerset across the whole country. The prosperity was spread, right? When you shift towards making the city of London the nexus of your economy, it comes at the cost of peripheral prosperity. People in the north were left to rot, basically. That's what happened. And it also, like I said earlier, it contributed to harming the entire UK in the form of the financial crash. So you could say the city of London, it actually did more harm than good for the UK. Or the way I put it is, the city of London needed to emerge to help bring the economy into a new age. However, she did it with very little care for unintended consequences. I think I said that later on, actually. But anyway, we're going to conclude now. So we're going to weigh things up and say, answer the age-old question, was Thatcherism considered a success? So the case for Thatcherism being a political success, okay, so I'm sure I've already made this clear, but when I say political success, I'm not saying that it was good for the country, or that their politics was good for the country. I'm saying a political success as in, it did what it sought to do, right? How successful was it by its own goals, politically? So the case for Thatcherism being a political success is extremely cogent. It remained an electable platform for well over a decade, with the Thatcher and Major governments mercilessly pursuing monetaristic and neoliberal objectives. Mercilessly. It was such a political force that it completely shifted the Overton window and rendered socialism an unelectable platform in Britain. So, it is true, like I said earlier, that the legacy of Thatcherism caused discord and caused electoral defeat for the Conservatives for many years, right? In the 90s and the 2000s. This is true, but it is also undeniable that her impact on the political scene can still be felt, and the UK would look dramatically different if it were not for her. Some would say for the worse, some would say for the better. That's irrelevant for this part. It has been massively influential and massively successful. So now let's go on to the one we were just talking about, the case for broader success attributed to Thatcherism. Success for the UK, it's less weighty. It's less weighty. The main impact of the ideology on the UK was the managed decline of industry and the anointment of the financial sector as Britain's new nexus, right? To some, this was necessary and revolutionary. You could argue that. I think it probably was necessary. It modernised the economy and it enfeebled the unions. However, these changes were made impetuously, and like I said earlier, they were made with little concern for unintended consequences. For peripheral communities, for working class sections of society, the ideology held with it a concomitant insistence that wealth creation is more important than wealth distribution, right? And hence, some say, well, look at the inflation rate and look at the growth of GDP in the country during this period. It's like, yes, but go and speak to someone who lives outside of London and tell them how they benefited from that GDP growth. They did not. They did not. So, you could say that this attitude from Thatcher and Major has paved the way for an underfunded public sector, a cavernous north-south divide, as well as a pervasive, extreme and intractable wealth gap. Many of the UK's most pressing issues had their first beginnings with Thatcherism. They have waxed, they have gathered strength, because of the continued neoliberal paradigm. because Thatcherism hasn't ended with Thatcher. And now they've taken the form of fearful and frenzied sicknesses in the fabric of the country. Thatcherism simply cannot be considered a success for the UK. When you look at the sorry state that the country is in, you can trace it back exactly to the prioritization of certain things over other things by Thatcher. Notably, her lack of care for anything outside of London, her lack of care for the working class, and her lack of care for peripheral communities. So I think it's quite clear, especially when you look at the statistics, that Thatcherism just cannot be considered a success for the UK. Politically, yes. Societally, no. Definitely not. Anyway, that's it. Went on way longer than I thought. That was only a 2,000 word essay, and I've gone and dragged that on for like 40 minutes or something. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you agree with what I'm saying. If not, argue with me in the comments. I've argued with a lot of people about this. I enjoy it. And I'll leave in the description my reference list. There's a couple of dozen references or so here. And I might leave a link to a shared document or something so you can actually read the essay. Because I did follow a lot of what I was saying, but I also added stuff, and it's not the exact same as what I've got written down. This was random. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I tried to make the essay not only a good answer to the question, but also a good introduction if you're not familiar with Thatcherism. It provides a lot of context to the way it shaped the world and the context behind how it came to power, etc. Very interesting subject, Thatcherism. Very interesting subject, especially if you don't like it, which I don't. Thank you for watching. I might make more videos on this. I've got other essays that I've written on more broad, like I've got an essay on India, for example, that I'm tempted to make into a video like this. And I think that's probably on a more pressing topic, but that's for another day. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please do not mind my unmade bed. You'll never walk alone. Bye.